Greetings and welcome. We are in AP English, and today we will introduce the great Victorian writer Robert Browning. I want to start, however, at 2B. That's where I'm going to begin. If you are on page 926 of your hymnal, and you turn to page 929 in your hymnal, back and forth we will go, you will notice that we are now going to look at two offerings by this classic Victorian poet. And we will want to begin both of these poems at 2B. You can struggle with these poems unless you understand form. These are both classic examples of the dramatic monologue. More than any other single examples that I can give to you that really showcase the dramatic monologue. The three high points, well, okay, I'll call them four. One will be Tennyson's Ulysses, the two Browning offerings that we will look at here, and then finally Yeats's Sailing to Byzantium. Taken collectively, if you know those four poems, you understand what we mean by dramatic monologue. Now again, let's remind you, we already covered some of this ground with dramatic monologue. Monologue, opposite of dialogue. That is to say, mono one. So you have a single speaker speaking, a la Shakespeare's soliloquies, right? But there is a dramatic context a la Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. So that, for example, when the partner stands up and introduces himself in the prologue of the Canterbury Tales before he gives his little speech, his little story, there's an understanding that there's a whole group of people, including his pal the Sumner, remember there, who's telling him basically, shut that project down, dude. We don't need to tell everybody that we're basically crooks, okay? There is a dramatic context. So as we look at My Last Duchess and Porphyria's Lover, I will tell you in advance, we are looking to answer two, I'm going to call them simple, questions. You want to write these in your notes at 2B. If you know these two questions, answers, then you're going to feel pretty confident with both of these poems. Question one, who is the speaker? And what can we kind of determine about the speaker? What do we know about it? Browning will exhibit remarkable understandings of the male psyche, certainly the male psyche. We'll talk about the female psyche as well, but the male psyche in these two poems. Who is the speaker? Who is this cat who is speaking in this poem? And he's the only one that ever talks. Number two, what is the dramatic contexts? What is going on? For example, is there another person there to whom he is speaking? The answer, by the way, in the first poem is absolutely. In the second poem, it becomes really disturbing to ask the question, to whom is this guy speaking? Okay, we'll get to it. We'll get to that one later. All right, let's go to Last Duchess. Now, the problem for us is we're Americans, and so already there's going to be some language issues here at play because we don't know what wealthy means. We think wealthy means having money, which, of course, in Europe, virtually had nothing to do almost with money. It had to do with property. Now, what is a duke? Do we understand what a duke is? Do we know what this is? This is a titled position that is handed through family title from generation to generation. So you could have a duke who has been in the family, this title, has been in the family for hundreds of years. Now, how do we know that a duke is a duke? Two things. One, he's got the name, he's got the title. Two, he's got serious amounts of property. That is to say, he can't get rid of it. He's got so much property, he cannot give it all away. Got me? So in other words, he's a multimillionaire all his life, and he does nothing for it. I mean nothing. In fact, to work is a complete and total insult. He will lie in his bed in the morning until he wishes to wake up. He will wake up on his own time. He will then ring a little bell, and into the room will come a servant, are you ready for this? Who will take his covers off of him so he doesn't have to do it. He will then be asked, what is it that you wish to eat this morning? And from this point on in his daily routine, somebody's doing something for him, and it's usually more than one somebody. He will live usually in a house that has at least 50 bedrooms. If it's smaller than that, it's an insult. He will walk through a property that he lives in that will be one of at least 5 properties. To have less than that is an insult. He will have properties all over the countryside that will belong not to him, particularly, but to his family. This is what I mean by saying wealth versus rich. He cannot ever lose this position. There's nothing that he could ever do that could allow him to lose his position. That's what we mean by a duke, okay? What is a duchess? A duchess is someone who is blessed to be married to a duke. And I use that word blessed intentionally because when a duke chooses his wife, the woman is graced with the power of his dukedom. She is called Duchess. Now, it's altogether possible, and usually it is the case, that she herself, as a young girl, will have been raised by somebody who had serious wealth, usually another duke. In other words, they worked really hard to keep the money within certain families. And the name of those families then start to become really famous in 13th, 14th, 15th century Italy, for example, or France, okay? Now, let's look at the title. What does it mean to say, my last duchess? If somebody were to say about a woman, that is my last wife, what does that mean to you? Right, clearly this game has been played before. In other words, usually when you say, that's my last wife, you're kind of aware that you have had or are seeking another wife, if you will, a replacement. Now let's go ahead and say it out loud before we read this classic poem. You're going to have a duke who is going to be talking about his last wife, who now is dead, and he has a remarkable portrait of her that he is going to show to another person. Question, who is he showing this to? At the end of the poem, I want you to be able to answer that simple question. We will continue our conversation in more exegetical depth tomorrow, but at least we'll begin by looking at the poem itself now. My Last Duchess. Read it with me. Again, you should have your hymnal open now to 926. Wow, watch this guy's psyche. No quotation marks, but everything you read now is one guy speaking. That's my last duchess, painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I call that piece a wonder now. Frau Pandolf's hands worked busily a day, and there she stands. Will it please you sit and look at her? I said Frau Pandolf by design, for never read strangers like you that pictured countenance, the depth and passion of its earnest glance, but to myself they turned, since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you but I. And seemed as they would ask me if they durst, how such a glance came there. So, not the first are you to turn and ask thus. Sir, 'twas not her husband's presence only call that spot of joy into the Duchess' cheek. Perhaps Frau Pandolf chanced to say, her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much. Or, paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half-flush that lies along her throat. Such stuff was courtesy, she thought, and cause enough for calling up that spot of joy. She had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad, too easily impressed. She liked whate'er she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. Sir, 'twas all one. My favor at her breast, the dropping of the daylight in the west, the bough of cherry some officious fool broke in the orchard for her, the white mules she rode with round the terrace, all and each would draw from her alike the approving speech, or blush at least. She thanked men. Good. But thanked somehow, I know not how, as if she ranked my gift of a 900 years old name with anybody's gift. Who'd stoop to blame this sort of trifling? Even had you skill in speech, which I have not, to make your will quite clear to such an one, and say, just this or that in you disgusts me. Here you miss, or there exceed the mark. And if she let herself be lessoned so, nor plainly set her wits to yours forsooth, and made excuse, even then would be some stooping, and I choose never to stoop. Oh, sir, she smiled, no doubt, whene'er I passed her, but who passed without much the same smile? This grew, I gave commands. Then all smiles stopped together. There she stands as if alive. Will it please you rise? We'll meet the company below then. I repeat, the Count, your master's known munificence, is ample warrant that no just pretense of mine for dowry will be disallowed, though his fair daughter's self, as I avowed at starting, is my object. Nay, we'll go together down, sir. Notice Neptune, though, taming a seahorse, thought a rarity, which Claus of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me. Now, one of the reasons why I love to teach a poem like this is because I want to point out to you the ways in which a genius poet can say things without ever saying them. Freud will, of course, make it clear that often human beings, when they speak, reveal things that even they don't understand or know about themselves. Later, it will be called, Freud didn't call it the Freudian slip. We will call it, of course, the Freudian slip. That is to say, a slip of the tongue or an observation which tells us something about what the person really thinks, even though the person maybe doesn't necessarily want to tell us. We have a very wealthy duke. He will draw aside the curtain. This portrait of his last wife, he says, is only drawn aside by him. And he will begin to speak about his last wife. However, while he speaks about his last wife, you, the reader, learn a whole lot more about him. What kind of man was he? What kind of husband? And how do we know anything about this guy? Because he reveals things about himself without understanding, maybe, that he's revealing things about himself. Let's go ahead and point out that Browning, through his poems, these dramatic monologues, taught us a lot about how to listen to what people are saying and hear what they're not saying. That's way more important than what they do say. Okay? This will, of course, begin, as we teach in communication courses, with any kind of number of nonverbal cues, right? So, for example, the way a person delivers whatever lines it is he or she is speaking says a lot about what he or she is saying. But then there's also what's not said, or what's inferred. So notice right away, he says, "That's my last Duchess painted on a wall, looking as if she were alive." So he makes it clear right away, she's dead. My last wife, she ain't around anymore. I call that piece a wonder now. What piece? The painting, right? The portrait. I call that piece a wonder now. Frau Pandolf's hands worked busily a day. Frau Pandolf, one of the famous painters. You had men whose life it was to travel around and to paint real life paintings, try to make them look as much as real, of these really wealthy people. Of course, today, these are all really famous portraits. If you go to Vienna and you walk through any number of those special houses, you will see these huge kind of paintings. Some of those paintings, I've seen one that is, the painting itself is almost as big as this floor is. This floor that I'm standing on. That's how big it is. And it's hung on a wall in a room where the ceiling is still quite a ways above the floor. Do you got me? So in other words, the painting hangs on a wall, and there's still a lot of wall around it. So it's a room with maybe 45-foot ceilings in a large room, and then you're supposed to stand 100 feet away from it and look at it and then walk closer to it. And as you walk closer to it, it starts to look very, very real, right? Okay, so that's what these guys would do. So he's got this painting, although not that big, but he's got this painting on this wall of his last wife, right? And he's ready to drop already a hint about who he is. He says, Frau Pandolf's hands worked busily a day, and there she stands. Will it please you sit and look at her? Okay, already we can answer a simple dramatic quality question. Who's he speaking? He's speaking with somebody, and he tells that somebody to do what? Simple. Sit down. Well, let's take a look at my last wife. You want to see what my last wife looked like? Let me just point out, she was stunning. She was hot. Clearly, physically very attractive. How do we know this? Because there's a portrait there. Who made that portrait? The best of the best. Frau Pandolf painted that. Notice he even says it. He said, I say, Frau Pandolf, by design. For never read strangers like you that pictured countenance, the depth of passion of its earnest glance, but to myself they turned, parenthetic, since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you but I. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Already, what do you want to write down about this cat in your notes? What are we already learning about him, and we're only 10 lines into this poem? What do you want to say about this guy? What would you say? He's cocky. Good, keep going. What are adjectives that come to mind here? Since none put by this curtain but I. What would you say about him? Not only does he have power, but what? He's aware he has power, and he enjoys letting others know that he has power. Nobody is able to see this picture unless I show it to them. And then he keeps going about Frau Pendolf. We'll come back tomorrow and do a bit more work. Thank you.